Welcome to everyone, and especially our presenters. I see that one presenter was early, Pieter, but the other one is still not with us. I'll keep my eye on that. He did say he might join at the start of the meeting, otherwise he might be half an hour or so late. All the paid-up members were invited to today's meeting. There was no change in the number of paid-up members during the past month. Now, all of you who attended the October meeting witnessed the passion and knowledge that Pieter showed in his presentation. I often listen to him on Monday afternoons, just before 7, between 6:30 and 7 in the afternoon. He's on the RSG, the Afrikaans radio station. And I hear they always introduce him as Pieter Geldenhuys from the London Business School. So we are very privileged to have you with us, and I look forward to another interesting presentation. Pieter, over to you.
Thank you, Johan. And I think you're in for a ride with Jay as well. I've known Jay for about 20 years, and we both teach on a number of executive training courses, but I really believe he's going to add a tremendous amount of value. But for the first 20 or 30 minutes of this presentation, we're going to talk about some geopolitical trends, some economic trends, and some demographic trends. And we're going to try and get an idea of where the future is heading and what we can anticipate in the next couple of years. So let's get started. And my role at the London Business School is that of a futurist. And that really focuses on unlocking some of the underlying trends under the headlines that we see on a daily basis. So how do we intentionally build capacity to see and understand the implications of change? That's what all of us needs to do if we need to be a prudent manager or a director of a company. I'm going to take you on a journey to talk about what we anticipate in the next couple of years. And I think this year literally amplified this message from Bill Gates a couple of years ago, saying that you'll see more change in the next 15 years than the previous 50. I think this year was a very good indication of some of the changes we'll see. But it's nothing compared to the long-term changes in terms of the global order and how that will change our world. I want to start my presentation by paying homage to William Gibson. He said, the future already happened. It is just unequally distributed. And that's one of the key terms that we're going to be using to unlock the opportunities of the future. So when we talk about the future, we don't only talk about the future that will happen, because there isn't, that's a construct that doesn't exist. We can talk about the future that could happen. What are the opportunities within this opportunity matrix that we can unlock? Some organizations would then say, it's fine to explore the future, but how do we unlock the opportunities of the future? And a number of organizations would then take a look at some of these key trends and then change their business models to unlock this opportunity. We're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about the future that's more evenly distributed. So when you unlock opportunities for the future, you look at the weak signals, because that's where the opportunity truly resides. The so-called blue ocean, red ocean strategy, rather than fighting where everyone is preparing for a future where the trends are clear and migrating towards an environment where the opportunities would be available in the environment where people don't normally focus or concentrate on. But that's part and parcel of our journey, perhaps for a second presentation, maybe next year. Another part of preparing for the future is realizing that the future is not predictable. So in a world of unpredictability, how do you navigate an organization in a space where prediction isn't truly possible? So that's where we are, in this very interesting domain where we need to talk about what the future might look like. One of the key elements where there's a huge amount of agreement upon is where demographics is heading. So let's take a quick look at how demographics will play a role in the not too distant future. If we take a look at where the world population is heading, we're heading towards anywhere between 10 and 12 billion people by the end of the century. Over the last 110 years, we had more people living on the planet than in the previous history of humankind combined before the year 1900. And on the screen, you will see this massive increase in population numbers all across the globe. But is that what we need to worry about? Well, again, William Gibson said, the future is unequally distributed. Because if we take a look at the world population numbers, in the current context, more than 50% of the world population is concentrated in 3 countries, namely India, China, and Indonesia. And that's not the picture that will occur in the next 100 years. We will have a complete shift in demographics around the world. Let me explain why we say that. So if we take a look at the world population pyramid, you must have seen this before. You take a look at the number of people, male or female, on the left or right-hand side between various age brackets, and what percentage they constitute of the overall population. So that's the world population, the so-called pyramid, with a lot of people at the lower end of the scale, with far less at the high end of the scale. What's quite important to realize is that a number of individuals, and one of the highest growing age brackets is those above the age of 100. So yes, we're living longer. And that is one of the key questions around what the future might look like. So let's go and take a look at a country-specific view. If you take a look at the US, a kind of a pyramid, where they will sustain their population through healthy economic growth, but also healthy demographic growth. If we however take a look at China, we're seeing fundamental shifts in the population dynamics. Their one-child policy didn't work that well. They had the Great Famine of the 1950s and then the one-child policy, and both of these had a huge impact on the population growth rate in China specifically. A little bit more about that later. Japan is in a demographic death spiral. In Japan, they're selling more adult nappies than baby nappies. There's a complete implosion of their economy, as well as in the future prospects, mainly because they've got a huge amount of people that's growing older, and yet there isn't young people to replace it or to replace the tax burden. And that's why Japan is over-leveraged with debt. But then we'll talk about that towards the end of this presentation. So Europe, same story as Japan. And we are seeing this in different countries like Italy, where we have a demographic death spiral. Debt is spiraling out of control. The young needs to pay higher taxes in order to sustain an older growing population, not only paying for the pensions of those that are growing older, but also paying off the debt of a previous generation. So in a lot of these countries, the youth literally disappears out of the country. And that's why you will find that in places like Japan and Italy, homes are standing empty. This has got a huge impact on real estate prices, and I don't think that has been felt yet in a number of these countries. The United Kingdom, a little bit better than the rest of Europe, so still a steady growth. And then if we take a look at South Africa, a huge increase in our population, especially after 1994, with a huge amount of optimism creeping into the market and people getting kids. That, however, is tapering off. However, the big picture to focus on is what will happen in Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa, this is the numbers in terms of millions of people, and you can see we're tapering off. We're getting less kids than in previous years, even 2 decades ago. But what's happening in Africa is this absolute explosion in people over the next couple of years. If we compare Africa to the rest of the world, we are seeing that most of the countries in the world will look at a population decline post-2050 to 2060, where the African population will continue growing unabated. There's an estimation that the African population will exceed 4 billion people by the year 2100. So that's what's happening. We're having this weird mixture of countries that are emerging, are growing, others that have declining populations and have entered a demographic death spiral. And the impact on this on geopolitics is enormous. And we're going to try and unpack some of those key trends in the next couple of minutes. So firstly, let's take a look at what's happening around the industrialized world, where we're seeing declining birth rates and where the elderly are growing or are living a fuller life even beyond the age of 100. And what the impact of this is directly felt on the so-called expenditure economy or the consumption economy. If we take a look at economic models, there's about 9 major economic models that we could utilize to define various countries throughout the world. But in broad terms, in a capitalist economy, there's 2 dominant mindsets, the so-called Austrian school of thinking and then the Keynesian school of thinking. So what's the difference between the two? The Austrian school is more supply side economics. So this is where we take a look at where we produce things, and through the production of goods, the value of our economy rises, and then the currency that is then printed to map the value of our economy is then increased to create an alignment with the productive capacity and the real wealth of an economy. The Keynesian school of thinking is more a demand side economic growth. Here they talk about let's print money or currency, depending how you want to define it. And by printing currency, you create a demand in the market that then creates the supply and then pulls the, creates an entire value chain based on this supply, on this demand side economics. So the demand side economics is based on literally consumption. And this is why over the last couple of years, we've seen advertisements of goods we don't really need to survive, but that would enrich our lives somewhat. What phone have you got right now? Is it your 11th generation smartphone that you have? Do you really need to replace your phone every 2 years? No, you don't need to. But that's what the entire consumption economy is focusing on, creating a demand in the market and then creating supply chains to fulfill it, and therefore by creating jobs in that ecosystem. And a lot of service sector jobs, as well as financial jobs, is then evident in some of the more industrialized economies. What's really interesting is if we take a look at expenditure patterns based on average age, we see that people start spending at about 25, because then they get married, they buy a house, they buy a car, they buy phones, they get kids, they need to be sent to school, there's education funds and tablets and smartphones and online game payments and Xboxes, you name it. It's a consumption economist absolute dream, where the youth then spends a lot of money based on their consumption ratios and the families that they then rear throughout the next 20 odd years. And then at about age 55, after the age about 50 or 55, the epoch of expenditure is reached at about 45, and then people start spending less as they prepare for retirement, that you might well know. But what's really important is this oversized importance of the 25 to 50-year age bracket in our modern consumption economies. And that's the key. And here's the key problem. The industrialized world is running out of affluent 25-year-olds, which means that the next 20 years, consumption patterns will decline dramatically in the majority of the rich countries around the world. Now, in a world economy where we focus on consumption to drive our stock exchanges, to drive our entire economic system, we talk about inflation. Because there's inflation, you need to make sure that the money that you generate on the stock market that you place at risk needs to be higher than inflation plus taxes that is deducted from your investments. And so your money is always at risk in some way in order to retain its purchasing power. But we always anticipate that a company should grow by 3 or 4% per year or 10% per year. And here's the question. How will these companies grow if the market that they focus on is declining, and declining severely in some economies? In the Chinese economy, we look at a 30% decline in that age bracket between 25 to 50. And a number of countries around the world are seeing the same picture. And this is all starting to happen around 2020, where the reality will be completely different to the expectation of a future of economic growth. Take a look at the impact on assets. A number of banks utilize real estate as an asset to justify their positioning within the market, and also the repo rate. So the overnight lending repo rate is all based on the assets that various banks have. Now, let's say that 10% of population declines in a certain area. What would that mean to the real estate prices? And how will that have an impact on the valuation of banks? That's another story for a different day. But I'm just giving you an indication of the major impact that the demographic death spiral in a number of countries will have on future growth forecasts. The International Monetary Fund has made a prediction that there would be strong economic growth in Italy in years ahead. But if you compare that with the amount of people between the age of 25 and 49, you see a completely different picture emerging. Now, I don't know exactly what the guy at the IMF are smoking. Maybe they should share that. They could make some good money on that, because it seems to be powerful stuff, because it's completely divorced from reality. because we are seeing a dramatic decline in the 25 to 50-year age bracket in Italy in the next couple of years. And with their banks completely overextended, a whole new ballgame will be coming our way. So this is an overview of what a number of European countries will look like in years ahead. If we take the US figures out of the picture, it looks worse, but this is what the European Union looks like. The demographics by 2030, a declining birth rate, meaning that we don't have a sufficient number of people to fund the retirement of a number of individuals that is starting to retire at this point in time. If we take a look at Russia, they had a debt default in the year 2000. You can see that in demographics, a huge implosion of the economy, and the entire population imploded. Here's the interesting thing, that in the next 10 years, the Russians will lose close to 50% of the armed forces. So the individuals between the ages of 20 and 30, which would be involved in the armed forces, they would literally disappear. And this has got a huge impact on warfare. Well, firstly, Russia is really worried because they've been invaded something like 20 times over the last 500 years. So they're really paranoid. And for them to protect their borders close to about 4,000 kilometers with half the current defense force won't be possible. You can already see the friction happening on the southern belly with Azerbaijan and Armenia, and the Russians are worried about that. Because with Turkey playing a far more dominant role, they might lose real estate, they might lose or they will face some severe difficulties specifically from Turkey, because Turkey is emerging local superpower. They're also worried about Europe. So in the Russian mindset, if they push forward and occupy territory to block or to minimize the amount of territory they need to protect, this would then mean a more secure future for them. And this is why they push forward into Crimea and into Ukraine and into Georgia, as this enables them to only have, I think if they push forward into that imaginary line, where that red dotted line is, the amount of border they need to protect then is limited about 500 kilometers. And that means that it's a completely different mindset that the Russians might have. We also will see changes in warfare, where automated tanks, automated drones, automated warfare will become far more pertinent in years ahead. So a very interesting element in terms of Russian geopolitics. If we take a look at China, I know the Chinese normally win the mathematics prizes. I just wish they had some individuals in their planning department, because it seems in terms of population planning, they failed their test miserably. If you take a look at some of these population figures, you'll see that from in 2040, let's take a look at the age group 50 to 54. That's about double the size than a generation that occurs literally 10 or 20 years after them. And that means you've built schools and infrastructure and cities, and suddenly the people to live in them and use them is no longer there. That's why we've got this huge amount of real estate in China that's underutilized. And the question is, what impact will that have on their economy? We all know that China is using self-funded finance. They didn't borrow a hell of a lot of money from abroad. So a lot of the debt they have, specifically their company debt, and I think if you add all the debt together, that's private debt, banking debt, non-banking debt, as well as government debt, they're about 300% to GDP, debt to GDP. So huge figures. Although the country debt is quite low, if you add up all the debt combined, you're sitting at 300% debt to GDP. But if there's a financial implosion, I think it will be more linked to their own currency, because most of their funding and their debt was based on local savings. So that's the Chinese demographics. And then finally, we look at the US. And I all know what you think about millennials. I've got my own idea about them. It's not those kids that can't think for themselves and have to be spoon-fed. But for the US, that's brilliant news, because they will drive the consumption economy in years ahead. So the US is looking pretty good in the next couple of years, as they will have an internal economy that would save them. And this is the interesting thing. The entire world knows this, where a lot of economies like Japan and Germany are now export-led economies, a huge amount of skills, older generation. And the only way they can sustain their economies is to export. And who they're going to export to, who can afford the goods that they make? Well, the Chinese are going to turn a bend, and the US will be about one of the only countries that are left. So for the last couple of years, we've seen that trade agreement, specifically with the US, was very rough, and was a rough and tumble affair, mainly because the US knows that they're in an excellent position moving forward. So if we take a look at if we remove the US from the entire world, we see a dramatic decline in population rates in the developed world. So a very interesting analogy, if you take a look at the screen in front of you, the dark red are those areas in the world that has an accelerating population growth rate. The rest have declining growth rates. And that's what we're looking at right now. Huge increase in sub-Saharan Africa and in the US. So that's the insight around demographics. And there's a couple of lessons ahead, namely a big pension crisis in a number of countries, increased healthcare costs, demographic death spiral in some countries, and a demographic explosion in others. So that's a brief overview of demographics. And now we need to ask ourselves, how will this impact geopolitics? Let me give you a brief overview of where we are. So the current economic order was based on the Bretton Woods system, signed in the mid-1940s, where the Americans realized that their biggest enemy would be the Soviet Union. And instead of allowing a number of economies that were decimated by the Second World War to fail, they then started an initiative where they said, let's utilize the military might of the United States, get allies to stand in front of us, and we will give them a security umbrella in which they can trade. So for the Bretton Woods system for America was always about security, getting allies against the Soviets. Whereas the members of the Bretton Woods system benefited from linking their currency to the dollar, which would at that point in time would have been linked to the gold standard, and by allowing free trade, where the American armed forces would ensure that there's free passage and that energy security and trade security would be paramount. That was the Bretton Woods system. And then in 1991, the Bretton Woods system's purpose collapsed with the collapse of the Soviet Union. And where George Bush had a whole bunch of people, Brett Scowcroft, a whole bunch of others, allocated at creating a new type of Bretton Woods system, he was voted out of office by Bill Clinton, and then, by the electorate choosing Bill Clinton. And ever since then, we had internally focused presidents. And this kind of Bretton Woods system kind of stumbled on. But the Bretton Woods system is collapsing under its own weight. And the Americans are really asking themselves, can we really afford to sustain a world order where we don't benefit from it? If we take a look at exports and imports as percentage of an economy, you'll see that the US has only got about a 12 to 13% exposure of imports and exports compared to their, to their GDP. If you take Mexico and Canada out of the equation, this falls to 5%. That literally means all imports and exports to the rest of the world can stop. And 95% of the US economy would be in place if they've got a good deal with Mexico and Canada. Simple as that. Can they still afford to have armed forces all around the world where they don't really get the benefit of that expenditure? And this is what we've seen under the Trump era, where they withdrew from the rest of the world, saying, we don't want to be the policeman for the rest of the world. Under Biden, we see a more nuanced play, but I think that the impact will be more on a diplomatic level and not really on a military level. And the question would be, with America, although their long-term future is not looking too bad, their short-term debt is enormous, and they might cut some expenditure on armed forces, which may leave parts of the world open to a lack of a security umbrella. So let's quickly take a look at energy security. I think I've got about 5 or 6 minutes left for my presentation. Let's briefly take a look at the impact of this on energy security. In 2007, this was the energy flow, mainly out of Saudi Arabia, Iran, to the rest of the world, with a significant amount of oil going to the US. This, however, changed dramatically by 2015, as fracking started to replace the energy needs of the US. And by 2020, we've seen that the US have become a net energy exporter. But they've got gas, and most of the stuff they just flare, they just burn it. So the Americans want to get a market for this gas, and they know that Europe as well geared towards a gas infrastructure, and they really want to sell their gas to Europe. So here's the US. They're spending a tremendous amount of money on NATO to protect the Europeans, and they want to sell the Europeans their gas because they don't have a use for it in the US. And what's happening at the same time is that Russia is building gas pipelines all the way from Russia straight into Europe. And the Americans are saying, whoa, hold on here. You are buying the gas from the Russians, but we need to pay for the armed forces that we put in Europe to protect you from the Russians. What's going on? So this is also why the US Congress have came up with the sanctions against those companies that are building the pipeline in Europe, if you want to know why. So it's all about geopolitics and economics. And if the American umbrella should disappear, we see that the following areas in the world might fall into conflict. Conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran, conflict in Eastern Europe, and most definitely a conflict in the South China Seas. So with the collapse of the American security umbrella, which I think Biden will strengthen, but I don't know if the finances to drive economic support will be sustained in years ahead. That's one of the key questions we need to ask. Now, what I'm telling you is nothing new. The Chinese have known this for years. In 2014, they launched the Belt and Road Initiative, where they created their own kind of Bretton Woods system, with all the countries between them and Europe, creating a corridor for energy security, but also for trade expansion. And that is the so-called string of pearls. You see, the Chinese doesn't have a blue water navy. The Japanese does. The Japanese can kick, the Chinese butt on open seas, but the Chinese need to protect their trade routes. And how they do it is to ensure a string of pearls, a number of islands where they can deploy their armed forces to, their missile forces to, with short-range missiles that can protect these trade routes. And that's why they entered into deals with Sri Lanka and Djibouti, where they gave them a lot of money, the countries couldn't pay it back. And they said, all right, we'll just take over your harbor for the next 99 years. And for the next 100 years, the Chinese have got military bases protected by fighter aircraft and missiles to protect these critical energy flows throughout the Indian Ocean and the South China Seas. So here's an interesting angle. I don't know if you know, but for about 5 or 6 years, there was a lot of talk about the Chinese consortium cutting Thailand in half, literally building a canal through Thailand, similar to the Panama Canal that we see in South America, or between South America and North America, but a canal that would enable all of the ships to pass through the Thai Canal rather than through the Straits of Malacca. About 90% of Chinese oil comes through the Straits of Malacca. So if there's a conflict with India or any conflict with Indonesia, they can literally block Chinese oil. And if the Chinese are running without oil for about 2 to 3 weeks, the entire Chinese economy and military will come to a standstill. So energy security is critical for the Chinese. And this is why they're playing this geopolitical game. With America removing itself from the world, we are seeing new power blocks emerging, and that has a huge impact on economic forecast for the next couple of years. So that's a brief insight. You can see there the amount of trade of China going through the South China Sea is about 40% of that trade. So it's enormous amount of trade, and it's got $1.4 trillion per year. And that's why this is important for China. Very interesting to note that the Thai government stopped this project about 4 weeks ago, and a week after that, big protests emerged between the red shirts and the yellow shirts. The red shirts, namely communist-inspired Thai population. So watch out for very interesting politics playing a role in Thailand and how the Chinese might use that to their benefit or advantage. A brief insight into geopolitics. There's a lot of stuff we haven't covered, but the US is decoupling from the rest of the world, and where Trump did it with Twitter, I think the Democrats will do it with PowerPoint. Increased trade wars, but with a Biden administration, we might see a softening of the trade wars, mainly because of the economic constraints that's being felt around the world. We're seeing the weaponization of the dollar more often, and I think, again, that will soften under Biden, but the rest is there. We need to realize that America can no longer afford this armed forces to support the Bretton Woods trade agreement, to create the freedom of the seas where they don't benefit from it at all. And that's a brief insight into how demographics and geopolitics will play a role over the next 10 to 20 years. I would have loved to take you through economics, but that is a whole new ballgame on its own. And I think my time is up. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Johan. Johan, over to you.
Pieter, thank you very much. Very interesting. I can see there are questions here. Christina, you're welcome to unmute yourself and pose your own question.
I just found there's so much information. I would love to be able to go over it again. I don't know if there are articles we can read or whether we can actually have a recording to go over this again and absorb it in our own time a little bit better.
Okay, the meeting has been recorded, so Pieter's presentation will be in the recording and I will make it available to everyone after the meeting. But I think you asked if Pieter has got more than what he showed us here.
Yes.
Pieter?
Yes, I do, Johan. This session that we spend about 20 minutes on, we normally take about a day on our executive training courses to go in depth into a variety of key things. I'm more than willing to share with you some economic forecasts as well, based on this geopolitical demographic play, but we can discuss that maybe next year. So I'm more than willing to share with you some of those key insights. In the meantime, I will make available a couple of very profound videos that would enable you to understand what the future might look like and what are some of the social and economic trends as well. But maybe that's a title for a different discussion.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then Bernard is asking, how will climate change targets affect the predictions of the future economy?
If we take a look at current levels, I think it might have a huge impact post-2050, so where it really becomes problematic and a number of countries will be faced by rising sea levels, a number of cities and a huge amount of economic activity linked to sea levels will be threatened. There are fundamental changes we can undertake in order to stop this. One of them is there's a fascinating documentary on Netflix that's called Kiss the Ground. Literally talking about the amount of carbon that's being released into the atmosphere due to plowing. The organisms that get disturbed in a huge amount of carbon, and you can look at the planting season in the US on a yearly basis to see how the Earth is being depleted of carbon. We are carbon-based beings. I mean, carbon is very important. But you need carbon to be captured in the ground, and one of the problems is we keep on tilling it, and this means that the carbon escapes to use extent. I think that's a huge amount of carbon being exposed. There's a number of key things we can do in order to reverse this trend. And if we have, prudent leaders, and I think under Biden, he created an entire new portfolio looking at environmental issues. If we can halt this in the next 20 years, then a lot of those long-term predictions will not come to be. But if we don't, we might see some severe changes in our long-term future. So it's the next 20 years are going to be critical, and therefore I don't want to make a claim about what we anticipate will happen. It will all depend on what we do in the next 20 years. Hopefully that makes sense, Sean.
Bernard, happy?
I just is concerned about this population growth. I mean, we know that the Earth has only a sustainable amount of, shall we say, resources, and you have this huge population coming up, and of course they all want to become like rich Americans. The Earth isn't really, just can't sustain such an event, and that's why I think it's going to have a major impact on the economics of the future in the world. That's my...
But this is a very interesting debate. It started about 200 years ago with a guy called Thomas Malthus. And he wrote that, if we take a look at the amount of resources on the planet, where it grows linearly and its population grows exponentially, we will have war, famine, and disease. And he predicted that the world we will have a complete collapse of our civilization when we hit 4 billion people. Well, now we're going to double that. If we take a look at another interesting figure, and I don't know if I have it with me, I can share that perhaps in a next presentation, is the cost of a basket of commodities. And the interesting thing is that we will anticipate that our resources becoming less and our population growing eightfold, that a basket of commodities will shoot through the roof. In all honesty, it fell by 50%. This is Economist magazine having done that study. One of the reasons is technology. So technology means we don't need copper cable anymore to make a telephone call. We now use airwaves. If you take a look at a small country like the Netherlands, they're the largest exporter of agricultural goods in Europe because they use technology in order to sustain a growing population. So I actually believe that our human ingenuity will save us. I think there's huge breakthroughs in energy, the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, a whole bunch of new energy solutions based on solar. If we have an abundance of energy, we can create fresh drinking water, potable water, because you just need energy to create potable water. So I see Africa exploding with solar cells, cleaning water, micro agriculture in the next 20 to 30 years. And we need to do that because we need to enable technology that enables a far more efficient production of food. Otherwise, you'll get migration into Europe and even into South Africa if that technology isn't applied. So I'm a bit ambivalent. I believe that the moment we stop technological progress, we might fall into Malthus trap. I'd buy it. But I think that the technology that we've created over the next couple of years, and also the organization that you belong to, you get these innovation. So the Kondratief waves. The Kondratief waves is a clear indication of how we reset the entire balance around productivity, efficiency, economic growth, and population growth. And every now and again, the innovations resets that time clock. But I completely concur with you that if the technology's progress is stopped, we're going to fall into Malthus' trap. On that, we concur.
Okay, thank you.
Dr. J. van Zyls, I'll send his profile. I attached it to newsletter 6, and you could see that was a comprehensive, impressive CV, like most of our presenters. I won't repeat it here. I was introduced to Dr. van Zyl by Pieter. Pieter introduced me to him. I had a few interesting Zoom discussions with him in the past month or so. He lives in Noordhaven on the peninsula, from where he conducts his international businesses. From his office house, he tells me he can see the mountain behind him and he can see the sea in front of him. He walks to a small shopping center where he tells me there's no technology, and he loves that. Now, that is a bit of a contradiction in my mind, but it sounds like heaven, and I'm sure we're going to understand this contradiction better once we've listened to him. So I'm very excited to listen to you, Jay, and over to you. Thank you.
Thanks, Johan, for that kind introduction. Hi, everybody. It's always great to speak to audiences who want to hear these topics, because you know that the world is not what it used to be. But every time we look at it, it's keep on changing. So that makes it exciting. Maybe just one or two things about this topic, and why I think it's quite important for us to discuss this, is that we are essentially a biological being that has been given an opportunity, or has evolved to have an opportunity to reason and to think about the world differently than some other biological elements on this planet. And our means of using creativity to produce various outputs meant that the technological inventions that resulted in all of our activity have created this world that we live in. And that's why I'm always fascinated by listening to Pieter about the kind of broader and the longer term predictions that are being made. But there are things happening right now that we probably need to keep an eye on. And I want to be touching on a lot of those kind of existing inventions that that have changed the way in which we see this augmentation of human intelligence and machine intelligence into this new kind of way of looking at the world. So what I'll be using is what's known as a mural. So it won't be slides. It's going to be one big picture, and I'll be zooming in on certain topics. And as you find some of those topics more interesting, we can then kind of focus on those more than any of the others. I've also, after discussing with Johan, we kind of morphed two kind of concepts into one. And the one is I'll be discussing some of the constructs around how human society has evolved and what this artificial intelligence and or various forms of intelligence are essentially doing to us. And then I've morphed a bunch of cases just for kind of reference points so that you can compare, in your own mind, why some of these things are happening the way they're happening. Most of my life, really, in my work situation, is doing this as a day job. So we invent algorithms that are essentially implemented in automated technologies. And I'm still very involved. My main office is in a city called Palo Alto. It's just south of San Francisco, in kind of the middle part of what's generically known as Silicon Valley. So we based at the SRI there at the Stanford Research Institute. And we decided as a family to be based in South Africa because we're involved in social and other activities over here where, as you know, for obvious reasons, you definitely want your kids to grow up in this kind of world that is much more diverse and places where they can individually make an impact, and sometimes entirely without technology, especially with people who invent technologies. And I think, Johan, that's probably what we should talk about a little bit later in a bit more detail. So let me share my screen, and let's just check that you all can see that okay. Can everybody see the total mural? Can everybody see the mural? You okay with that?
Yes. Yes, Jay, thank you. We can see.
Okay, so after our conversation last time, I decided that I'm going to name this talk Human Organism as Algorithm. And basically what it means is that in the world of intelligence, that means human or machine or otherwise, the fundamental outcome is to make sure that whatever you invent will be able to get that community to behave in a way that is beneficial to you as the person that wants to influence them. So that basically means that in the innovation world of artificial intelligence, the primary focus is to see the human purely as a programmatic organism. And that means that every bit of news that you give that person, every technology that you get them to immerse themselves in, anything that they get involved in over time, must be for the outcome of what you want, not what they want. And that's kind of the consequence of why the world looks the way that it does today. And that also is a consequence of people like myself that ban my children from technology up until they got to their teenage years, that fundamentally have strict rules around how you deal with technological news or other forms of immersion. And that's really what the field of computational social science is about. So just by means of introduction, let's just think about, the construct of humanities in relation to technology. On a continuum, on a one end of humanities, there's a study of the individual through the discipline of psychology or various forms of psychological phenomena that really the primary purpose is to understand how the human fits within its society. If that community decides that the human does not fit, its purpose is to alter the human state or to exclude them from that society by means of declaring a thing called a condition. If you then are declared as having a certain condition, there will be a remedial process, and that remedial process purpose will be to alter your state or to remove you from that society where you don't fit. And I think we all kind of understand that as the discipline of psychology. It's about the individual. On the opposite end of this continuum, there's a study of a society as a whole. It is the anthropological phenomena of how an entire community or a larger group of people will fundamentally believe or disbelieve certain phenomena and will essentially embed that phenomena through means of structure. And if you think of the principle of capitalism or communism, or many of the kind of societal rules that have been put in place, are all essentially anthropological phenomena in our world. Then there's this discipline that sits in the middle somewhere, and that is just generically known as the social sciences. And that is essentially the tiniest community of two to a community of large groups of people that show some kind of homogeneous behavior or homogeneous based activity. So what the technological world cares about, and every time that you hear a conversation about a company that you know that focuses on global platform deployment, so that could be your favorite social media platform, your social video platform, Zoom, basically the technology in right now, this is what they care about. This is what they discuss in their boardrooms every single week. This is what they reason when they find out what kind of inventions they're going to be focusing on. Because at the end of the day, the purpose of your technology is to be sold and to earn economic benefit. And that means that you have to have an anthropological view of that society to understand its capacity to accept your ideas, and then your ability to manipulate those people to believe that your ideas are more valuable, generically known as marketing, and then the ability to then push that particular product into that society by whatever means possible for economic return. So in the old days, and I know some of you might be interested in this, and I'm sure you might have a pretty decent share portfolio, or you're busy, and obviously for those who know a little bit about this discipline would have started trading with all vigor in around April this year. Why? Because we know that in human society, if it's a pandemic or not a pandemic, humans inherently get scared. They get scared of the unknown. They get scared of things that are going to change their world the way they know it. And that means that that is highly programmable. The fact that you can induce fear and you can remove fear and you can ride that wave and essentially control that through various forms of technological inventions. Now, this essentially is the entry point for all of what happened in the world of intelligence, and especially machine intelligence. Because in a machine intelligence world, what you want to do is to deal with the mass amounts of data that you have to collect about humans so that you can fundamentally understand this organism. And at the end of the day, you can then get this organism to believe your story. And that's really the basis of a lot of the artificial intelligence world kind of got going. So let's just talk about kind of the next section that's got to do with human imagination and how we got here in the first place. And let's just start with what we call the human mega waves of transformation. If you had to think of just the last 100,000 years, there was a time when we did not speak to each other as humans. So if you just had to think about this, and this is the fundamental question that get posed the first time when you move, like myself as a technologist and mathematician, into social sciences, you get asked this question. What did that human do the day before they started speaking? What happened? How did we live our lives as humans before we could speak? Because the FOX2P gene that sits in our genetic makeup got us to move our tongues the way that we move it. So we had to be able to take our creative mind and visualize an alternate outcome, break the rules of how we saw the world always working, start moving our tongues even though our family members were not speaking. And at some point we had to be devious, breaking the rules, moving the boundaries so that we could basically take our new capabilities and start using them. Now think about it, that we then lived for 40,000 years, give or take, from the point we started speaking as a race, before some human woke up one day and decided, today is a good day to start writing stuff down. What made that human wake up that day and say that from today, I'm not going to just speak anymore or make the noises that I make. I'm now going to create a representation of it by drawing something. And it doesn't matter initially if it was a caveman drawing or a cave person drawing or eventually a hieroglyphic. But with this hieroglyphic and the ability for somebody to create a symbolism and abstract linguistic constructs and a society into something abstract, modern society was formed. And in early days, if you think of the Egyptians essentially created the model that is still fully enforced today, where the person that is at the top of the pyramid, being the pharaoh, has got all of their government officials that have to basically comply to the pharaoh's fundamental view of how they see the world working. You then had the soldiers, the scribes, the merchants, all the way to the bottom, where you had what was known as the slave, the person that sits in the system. And that person in the system, within the pyramid, had no right. And that means that it's got no freedom of reason, no freedom of understanding. And we went through, you all know this, the era of enlightenment, and we got through a point where we wanted to know who we are as a race. And this is where the intelligence piece of it, plus the machine intelligence, really started making an impact. Because initially, Charles Darwin, for those obviously who know the concept of evolution, Charles Darwin said that there's this tree of life, and the fact that every tree is fundamentally separated from another tree. What we do know today is that he made one major mistake, and the major mistake is that there is no tree. Every gene, every interaction, everything that is on this planet, because we are in a constant state of being connected, means that it is totally networked. So that means that the way in which your biological brain works is almost the same as every other living being's biological brain. There is something that happens in the human brain that is slightly different, because we've got an error in the way that the chemical reactions affect our a way of how we reason about things without getting into the technicalities of it. But basically the outcome, and what I want to get to, is that the innovation world in the context of artificial intelligence started looking at this and saying that you should never look at the problem that you're going to solve in its own right as a singular unit of analysis. It should always be seen in the context of a network. So that means you can never look at the individual on their own. You must look at the individual in the context of their family, of their society, of their school system, of their friends, of their communities like this, of the countries within which they find themselves. And that means that that overall view of understanding the network means that you can go and find the central points of influence across every possible discipline. And that means that the companies like Facebook created what's known as the social graph. LinkedIn, for those who know LinkedIn, created the economic graph. Google created the knowledge graph. And that means that each one of those larger organizations who essentially control global platforms for data collection have to figure out one thing, and that is that nothing exists in isolation. Everything is totally interdependent and connected. And that means when we collect data, we can predict almost every single being on the planet's behavior by knowing all of the behaviors of the people around them. And that means that if we have access to this data, just imagine the tools that can be constructed on top of that while we're busy reinventing everything that we thought existed in the physical world that can be abstracted into a digital space will be abstracted. And that is what fuels trillions of dollars of growth globally. And I'm not sure if you discussed it with Pieter, but if you had to look at the top 10 wealthiest companies today, remember it used to be fuel, manufacturing, and all those. Today, there are none of those left as the world's richest companies. You know, Apple broke through $2 trillion. Microsoft is on their way there. Google is on their way there with Alphabet. Facebook is already halfway there. So that means the world's largest organizations controlling economic wealth in the modern world are all essentially abstract digital companies that own the planet's data points, that owns the behavior, and they know that they can influence the behaviors of hundreds of millions of people at a time without those people ever looking at it or knowing that it's happening to them. Because very few people will go, before they use that technology, go to the About Us at the bottom of the screen or the top of the screen and go read the license agreement. When people get married, they read their contracts. When people buy cars, they read their contracts. When people engage in business agreements, they read their contracts. And yet, every single day, billions of people use these technologies and never read the fundamental license agreements that get them to share everything about their lives with the organizations that they give this to. And that part of it essentially fueled the essence of the input mechanism into what we see in the intelligence world today. So how does it play out? And let's just quickly look at kind of how we see it in the world of social sciences. We kind of look at it like this, right? So if you had to think of 9,000, 10,000 years ago, all the way through to the 1400s, let's just think about it for a moment. Through this period, all that the humans essentially got involved in, if they wanted to do a prediction, was to look at its environment. And for those who know the story of Copernicus, he kind of through his own research figured out, and looking at predicting how, the sun and this earth and the moon rotate, he figured out that, hang on, the earth is not the center of all of its own existence, but the sun might be more important than earth. When he eventually exerted that through narrative, he got killed, as you know. What is the consequence? The consequence is that he put in motion a new thought. It is a little bit like the 18th dynasty pharaoh who put in motion the thought that there's a single God system. He invented the single God system because at the time there were multiple gods, and he said there's too much work to serve all the gods. We're going to have a single God system. He got killed for it. And eventually it became the primary narrative that drives all of modern theological and other forms of society. So that means original thought typically gets you into very serious trouble during this period because your story was isolated. Your story could be ring-fenced. Your story immediately could be trapped. So what changed it all for us in the 1400s going onwards was that we had the ability to take thought and reasoning, articulate it, put it into an instrument, and deploy it beyond our own existence. We removed time from the information dissemination cycle. You did not have to be present in a modern world to tell people what you have learned through your life. You just have to document prolifically the lessons that you have learned, and that makes it valuable. And now you find that what got the growth and what really got population growth globally to explode was the ability for diverse communities around the planet to store an endless amount of data points and an endless amount of intelligence. That means that an interpretation of an understanding of the data point that I'm looking at, and have a separate community somewhere else in the world extracting it at a different time for a different purpose without you having to be present. And that, by the way, is the ultimate growth of human population growth. And that means that wellness, economic wellness, financial wellness, human intellectual wellness, and procreation wellness. And if you look at, basically the death rate, how we deal with medical conditions, and because this intersects with our obsession with digitization, the human genome, that is now one of the world's biggest data sets, basically can now be superimposed on every possible lifestyle, human event, human activity, human conversation, human migration, human eating habits, humans, basically the entire human sense portfolio can be mapped onto a generic code, and you could essentially create the ultimate being in a laboratory if you wanted to. And the technologies are there. They are being invented. And we know that from some years ago already, you can go to MIT, and if you've got a certain condition, they're looking at Alzheimer's, they're looking at, certain people on the spectrum, and you can have a brain implant, and the idea is that you should be able to fix that through a means of augmentation. So let's just think about how that drove in the context of industrialization. During the 1700s onwards, there was obsession with taking muscle and automating it. So that means building a steam engine, railroads, transportation. Excuse me, it was the era of mechanization. During that era, a human had to use intelligence, its physical body, and its hands to perform certain actions. As we moved into the world of mechanization, the machine had gears and arms that performed the same action. That was the early days of intelligence, machine intelligence. By the time we got to the 1800s and we looked at the acts of production, the acts of mass production is the ability to remove the human entirely from the act of making something and move it entirely into a cognitive process, so that it's the person that can creatively think about the idea and create the instrument and the tool that will automatically make the outcome. And we now are living in a world, era of information and era of AI, where all other forms of human intellect is going through exactly the same revolution. And that means that if you wanted to find the better way of solving a problem for yourself medically, or solving a problem around your financial portfolio, or solving a problem around to solve something, it does not mean you're going to be able to use your own intuition anymore, because it will be wrong. Because the world is being augmented with all of the intelligence around it that essentially is now going to affect how we make decisions in our day-to-day lives. And that's what the artificial intelligence world is obsessed by, is saying that, do we have enough data points, enough evidence in the modern world that we can essentially control and manipulate all of modern society through data points? And that's what we just kind of call enabling platforms. Because once you are embedded in the platform, you can't decide not to participate. You are essentially dragged into it as a human if you want to be part of a society. You cannot say, I'm going to stop using any of the technology. I'm going to stop using the transportation systems. I'm going to stop using any of the mechanisms that collect data about me indefinitely. So let's just look at a quick first case example, all right? And I'm sure most of you will remember a company called Nokia. Nokia was an amazing business. Remember the days when we had battery life, 1 week. We had a whole week of our phone not dying. You know what I mean? We didn't have to charge it every single day or sometimes twice a day. I mean, those were great times. But this is the fundamental interesting thing about Nokia though. Nokia was an absolute innovation machine. Here on the left is a portfolio of the companies all the way through to the point where they killed their device. And let me tell you what the fundamental scary thing about this case is that they did everything absolutely 100% correct. They ran surveys to their customers and asked them what they wanted all the time. They made sure that they listened to everybody around feedback that they got from people around the world. And everybody used to say, check the device, it's amazing. The battery lasts, it's reliable, it's a good quality product. The software works well. And every time I do an upgrade from one device to another, the software still works the same. And they essentially believed their own story, and they drew the boundaries of their own creativity around what they thought people were saying to them. And as you know today, no great invention was created in modern times by listening to any of us. Apple did not come to you. Your favorite motor car company did not come to you to ask you what you like. Your fashion design company did not come to you to ask you what you like. Your TV or electronics manufacturing company, nobody came to you and asked your opinion. Nike did not come to you to ask your opinion about what shoe design they're going to give you. Your glasses company did not come to you to ask you about the design. Nobody came to you. So the question is, how does it work today? So that means that by the time Apple created the first platform, they basically said, whatever the world used to be, nothing like it is going to be useful in the future, because all people actually truly need is a platform of human activity that can allow them full control over their own existence. And that means that the acts of design and the acts of consumption is not the provider's responsibility anymore. It is you and my responsibility now. You and I are the people who are now going to decide what works and what doesn't. And that means that with that comes this deep interest in manipulating us to use the things that are available to us. Nobody came to you and sold you your favorite smartphone. Nobody came and explained it to you and gave you the benefits. Nobody did the insurance salesman thing to you to sell you your latest device. It got naturally absorbed into your life. You had the capacity to just take the new idea and fundamentally kill everything else that was in your path and accept it. How did they do it? That's the question of a modern business. And that means that understanding this capacity and how that comes together is the holy grail of all of modern artificial intelligence, especially in how you would want people to adopt and use certain technologies. So what I did more for interest's sake, Johan, is this. I included this. I know, I don't like to talk much about COVID, because I think it's just another pandemic, isn't it? So if you look at the theory of contagion, 1918, and if you look at before that, and we've had crises all the time. And as you know, the next crisis is only 4 years away, as you all know. So that means that it's going to come. We just know it's coming and going, and you know that when there's a crisis, it's a time when you're supposed to jump in, because you know that humans are recovery machines. We love to bounce back. So if you look at historically, and if you look at, every time that there's been a financial crisis, there's a very, very simple pattern of behavior. And a simple pattern of behavior is the fact that there's always this recession indicator. There's a corporate debt that you see when people get into trouble is when they borrow more. And there's the real gross domestic product. So that means that you find that debt goes up, productivity goes down, crisis gets created. If you have the financial means, you jump in because you know you're going to come out the other side. And so far, there's been cycle after cycle. So if you had to look at, this is kind of an internal COVID dashboard, we could clearly see that when that first Chinese hump happened, and we saw that the markets dumped, we knew that the uplift is going to be a mega swing. And for those who jumped in April or whatever the time was, even if you delayed it a little bit, would know their portfolios today would be up. I think I'll check mine, it's maybe up 60%. So that's a good return for a few months if you just know that humans bounce back. And the fact that humans love to overreact, humans love to take this immense action because it's programmable. It's easy to do that. It's easy to influence them in those ways. And it's very vivid to the person who analyzes this community. So let's just think about how this is done. And the next section, what I'll do is I'll cover a couple of cases, and this is called the capabilities of computation, because that is what essentially changed all of this for us. It's the fact that all of these abilities to do this became accessible to all of us. And this is a little bit technical, and I know that the idea was not to get into the technical pieces of this today, but let's just think about the construct for a moment. In the 1950s, there were a series of research projects. And the outcome was that if the machine that is going to perform data tabulation and some form of processing can continue on the growth that it's on, it can become much more than just being a machine that is for storage and recall. Because there are some parts of how humans behave that is highly specific and specialized around the data points that we need to collect about those humans. And initially, the only data that was collected had to do with your insurance company, your bank, your telecommunications company, your medical provider. There were a handful of companies that collected data, your government tax authorities. We had no view of the human social existence in all of the other technologies, like the call that we're on right now. How do you know when you bring all of these together, what truly can happen? So what the world has done, and you think of the broader world of artificial intelligence, and within that there's the world of machine learning, started breaking up different disciplines, and it started tackling every possible problem that a business or a human would experience in a modern world, and finding algorithms and computational means to essentially make all of those bits intelligent. And that means that everything that you touch today, from the point when you drive your car, open your fridge, use your phone, everything that you do is augmented with some form of intelligence technology. When you go to your doctor to have a scan done, that scan goes through an algorithm, and it will tell you that, yes, this is a probability of it being whatever it is, depending on what the condition is that you're testing for. So that means that we know that between unsupervised taking data that we know that is unlabeled, kind of raw data sets, the way in which you would take data that we know exactly what it is around understanding human, if you look at, like, when you go to your bank, you give it your name, your address, all of the bits that they need to know about you to be able to service you. And then the ability to take what they have predicted about you, make the prediction, observe to see if you actually behave that way, and then alter the prediction algorithm in real time to do it again. And we're going to tackle one or two examples in the context of South Africa as well in a moment. So let's just think about it this way. So there's this phenomena that we call the unsatisfied human. You have to work from the basic hypothesis that humans will never be happy with the current state of affairs. We are deeply upset about everything around us when things go well. We want to change everything. We don't like our governments. We don't like how people behave. We don't like population growth. We don't like finance. We love to complain about everything. And then some of the ones who do that fix it. So let's just think about this problem. So when the first printing press was created, the printing press was created because somebody got bored by creating manual prints, creating a manual print and having to do it with a mechanical device. And somebody looked at that situation and say, I've got a discourse with it. And I would want to fix this thing because there must be an easier way to do it. Because I got too many humans in a factory. I cannot predict my ultimate outcome. I don't know how many authors I'm allowed to print books for because I only can print what people are going to buy. There are some great ideas out there that I want to support, but I can't. So eventually, the machinery that was created was focused on mass production and single human oversight. So think about the world of taking intellect and putting it into print. The newspaper or the mass production shifted the participation network. Initially, there were one or two or a handful of authors that participated in the network and provided input. Now, if you think about it, or during this era of the newspaper, what happened was that you could have hundreds of authors or journalists write, and you could mass produce the output, and you could alter the business model, and you could build a new form of prediction to predict what kind of input or content will appeal to what kind of audience over what time frame for what economic benefit. But you still had to measure it entirely based on sales, because if you read a newspaper at home, what are you actually reading? I mean, which paragraph are you liking? Which author do you truly like more than another? Nobody knew. And that's why we had a discourse with it as humans. We said we don't want that anymore. What we actually want is to automate this whole thing. And this picture over here, by the way, is an actual print-on-demand factory today. This is what a massive book printing warehouse looks like today. That means that there is no just-in-time, there's no warehouse, there's no storage, there's nothing of any sort. The moment you go to Amazon or Barnes & Noble or whatever the bookstore is you're going to buy a book from, I think in South Africa they might still ship it in physical container pre-printed books. But when you order a book, the moment you press purchase, it then sends a print request to these print-on-demand machines, and it prints 1 or 100 for the same price. And if it needs to ship it to you, it will shrink wrap it, package it, label it, put it on that little rail, so that the device who's going to deliver it to you, that probably being somebody who's a courier service, will take it to your door. And everything was done without any human in sight. What could we predict at the time? If you think of in the context of building predictions or intelligence, we could predict how many authors were selling how many books. And now what we could also do is, if an author only has one book that they want to sell to the entire race, it made no difference. You didn't have to have an outlay. You didn't care about warehousing. You cared about nothing. You just cared about the fact that it's going to get to that person as an individual. But humans are unsatisfied. We had a problem with it. And we said, no, we don't want the physical thing. We're done with that. And we now have, in a modern world, let's just think about how it works today. This is a Google data center in North Virginia. They add about 4,000 computers per day to this data center. And as you know, it stores a couple of zettabytes of data. You might have a couple of gigabytes on your phone, or maybe a terabyte on your computer, but these things store, exabytes plus or zettabytes of data. And why does it do that? Think about it. Think about how it works today. You go to your favorite bookstore and you search for a topic that you like. Or you go and search for a certain electronic or a certain device. You discuss it with your friends over Facebook. And obviously, Facebook license agreement is very clear. Track every content conversation and make sure you can sell it to the partners who pay for it. By the time you hit the next site or the next community, and you go to your favorite Pinterest site and you search for clothing because you may be interested in fashion, it pops up every now and then a picture of an author of a book that you were searching for just a moment ago. Then what you do is you go to Google and you search for something, and you see on the right-hand panel something appears that was directly related to the search that you've just done. You then end up going to your bookstore to buy your book, and by now it knows what topic you like, what time of the day you like the topic, what kind of conversation you like. It knows your levels of anxiety, it knows your personality type, it knows everything about your human existence that has already created a multidimensional view of you as the human. And then augments that with the actual behavior based on the prediction that it's made. So the moment that you open up the book, in your favorite, book reader. It knows the time of the day, the topic. It knows how long and how much time you spent on the index page. It knows how many times you've gone to Wikipedia to look up a word. It knows how many times you've made notes about the content you've just been involved in. It knows how many pages and how many comments that you've made to friends after you've read the book when you send them a note to say that this is a good or not a good book, or this paragraph is great or not great. It knows the impact of the language that you have used by the time you go talk to your friends about the influence that the book had on your comments that you've made to them over all of your other channels. And that means that everything of your modern existence is deep linked. It's called deep app linking. Every major digital company is totally immersed in the sole purpose of collecting human evidence of behavior and then finding all the possible tools to manipulate that system for maximum economic benefit, $1 trillion at a time. That is how it works today. Everybody okay with that? I'm sure that's kind of old news, isn't it? So let's just look at all the other cases where this works like this too. And maybe just, I don't know if anybody has read anything from Yuval. I'm not sure if you guys are familiar with Yuval's work. Yuval Noah Harari. He's a great author, by the way. He's based in Jerusalem, in Jerusalem University, and he's often in Stanford as well. But basically, his kind of view of the world is that all human organisms are just algorithms, firstly. Secondly, also know that all forms of intellectual capabilities are fundamentally separated from global consciousness. What does that mean? It means that even though you know that climate change is going to affect how we live, population growth is going to affect the human race over time, eating meat will definitely create more medical conditions downstream, smoking or drinking too much will at some point cause harm, doing the wrong thing will get you into trouble. Intellectually, the human is fully capable of reasoning practically about anything it likes. And yet it still does it over and over and over again. And that means that programming of the consciousness is what most of artificial intelligence is interested in. Is saying that, can you create a new anthropological global society that is fully programmable? And that is the entry point. And anyway, for those who want to go read Homo Deus or, Sapiens or some of Yuval's work, it's really a great insight from an anthropological point of view, because we also use what's known as computational anthropology. So we use math and other means of determining a societal shift and kind of change over time.
Jay, it's painful for me, but I have to give you a time check.
Okay, cool. How many minutes have I got left? Am I out of time?
I think I expect a few questions as well. So if you can wrap up, say, within 5 minutes, it will be nice.
Okay, so I'll just give brief narrative of this, and for those who are interested, go do some more research afterwards. Think of a company like Uber. Uber is fundamentally interested in your ritual and your behavior. It's the matchmaking of the driver with the passenger and predicting what you're going to do, when and how you're going to do it, and at what point will they be able to intervene with that activity. If you think of your favorite music service, like this is a Spotify example, it's algorithmic matchmaking. Can you matchmake the best rhythm, beat, and lyric with the listener? Not the genre, not the artist, not its popularity, not its social network, the quality of its content, the quality of the music that it actually makes with the person that actually listens. And then from then on, everything that you do is a data problem in the music world. It's got nothing to do with music anymore. If you go to companies like IKEA, and I'm not sure, it's not that well-known idea, but basically what you have is you got the way in which you bring people into your digital communities, the way that you deal with your out-of-store activity and your catalogs and your digital immersion, the way that you deal with the in-store experience, all of that can be created through VR apps that is augmented reality on an app itself, that you can go and take a picture of your room, place the furniture from the catalog and say purchase, and boom, you could be able to place it in a place where you had your augmented view of your room done before the time. You don't need a consultant anymore to come tell you what your house should look like. So that's kind of the capability. So for a South African example, I thought it will be good for us just to tackle one that I think most of you might know. We did a series of anthropological studies in South Africa to look at the great rituals and to see how much of this is programmable. And as you know, South Africans we are some of the easiest people to program, you know that. All that you have to do is drop one tiny, really bad idea into one central network, and you can track its distance as to how many people will believe the story. And I remember when, at the beginning of the pandemic, you could clearly see it. You could see that somebody will say, is there going to be a speech by the president tonight? And you see people will say fake news, or it's not, or yes, it is. And you can almost observe the tremors of how it's society, and you can measure the absorptive capacity. You can measure the degree of basically the degree to which you can drop in any story for that person to believe. And then you can start matchmaking stories, and you can build a social structure to see the rituals, because the April ritual and the December rituals, as you know, are very different in this country. You got these great migrations, because there's a thing called immigration light. That's kind of language I heard recently when I got back to South Africa a few years ago, that you migrate from Johannesburg to Cape Town to Canada, or Johannesburg to Cape Town to Australia. And then you realize, oh dear, it doesn't work anymore. Then you migrate back to Cape Town or back to Johannesburg into a different place. So you find that there's this great shift of people moving around, and all you have to do is track financial activity. And that means that if you want to predict what they're going to buy, where they're going to eat, what car they're going to drive, how many times they're going to put in fuel, what they're going to do next, what kind of clothes they're going to wear, when they're going to go to what kind of sports exercise, what kind of bicycle they're going to ride, whatever, is all predictable. You basically can work out the rituals of that entire society. Anyway, so let me show you one example. And for those who are interested, you could probably go to Discovery's annual report. And I took this straight from the 2017 annual report. We spent a couple of years working with part here of Discovery called Discovery Bank. Myself and one other computational social scientist were involved in designing. We're very involved in financial wellness, just to make sure you all understand that in the computational social science world, there are people that deal with propaganda and government work. And myself and my business, we do none of that. We never touch that. We don't do any form of social manipulation or anything like that. But what we do is we're very involved in wellness. So financial, economic, and other forms of wellness work. So think about this example here for a moment. Discovery created what's known as a behavioral chassis. A behavioral chassis is to say that, is there a way that you can essentially give points or benefits to a person that wants to participate in an overriding holistic wellness initiative, driving financial and health, and then construct a point system that helps them to live to that kind of output, so that we understand the risk as an institution, the customer understands the risk as the recipient, and in that way you can then basically give them a transparent game to play. Because you know the story. In social sciences or in some of the philosophies, we kind of have this view that there is only one primary question as the meaning of life. I don't know if you ever thought about it, but in our world it goes something like this. It's that you wake up every morning and you go, do I play the game or don't I? That's it. There is no other question. There is no other question that supersedes that in our world. There is no other question that kind of transports that, because every day you have to decide, am I playing the game? And if you don't decide to play that game, you find another game. But you have to play the game. While you're alive, you play the game. Because once you're done, your game's up. So that means for now, you have to work out that if the game is that people want to be well, they want to participate, make sure you incentivize them to stay well. And alongside what you do, you then have a multitude of machine learning mechanisms by which you make sure that your iterations of predictions become more and more accurate over time across every part of your business, so that it's transparent to the customer. That's why, like this organization, put it in the annual report. They publish it. They tell you this is how they're going to do things. And that's why if you had to buy like Discovery shares during the crisis, the first thing people get scared of, pandemic, we're going to kill 10% of the global population. Like in 2019, 70 million people died. We know things are different. Well, how do we know it's different? Medical platforms are better, generic understanding is better, global distribution is better, global networks are better. If you then take that error out of your thinking and you reason, you say, well, maybe less than 1% of global population might die one day. But by then, we would have invented something to solve that. So that means all the organizations who initially got penalized during the crisis had to do with medical provision and so on, their share price tanked. But we all know people overreact. And that's a kind of human condition, isn't it? It's a highly programmable data point that you can work out through an intelligence algorithm that it's going to happen. Anyway, so the concept is just that you iterate over and over time to the point where your algorithms become more accurate. So it doesn't matter what technology you're touching, you know that at some point it will know what you do. And this last picture, Johan, maybe just to show people quickly, is that there's this kind of total immersive view of all of the things that are part of your life. Your tracking device, your device on your phone, the screen that you're on right now, if you've got Alexa in your house, if you go to your doctor, if you drive down the road, if you fill in your tax forms, when you go to your bank and pay a bill, when you use Uber, when you go to any of your devices, all those data points are entry points into building prediction algorithms that essentially are designed to create an existence that is augmented for you. And I think, Jan, that's kind of goes back to the why you open it up, why I try to keep my kids a little bit away from that. Why I quite like this village where I'm living in, where I can still walk down to the restaurant and I don't have to be connected to anything. I kind of turn my phone off and then go down there and it's kind of quiet. You know, you don't have to worry about anybody tracking you just for that short period of time that you know that you can kind of get away from it all. Anyway, so the idea was just to give you a picture of the fact that there's the human imagination that will not stop humans from rethinking a situation. It's not going to happen. We will continue that. And even if we destroy ourselves, we are just on that track. You're not going to stop it. Doesn't matter how we theorize about it, we know that it continues. We know that there's continual corrections. Every time we say correction, we know that a generation that has not been part of that will always be more optimistic than the ones who were before them. We know that the computational capabilities are exploding. So that means there are zettabytes of data. And now what's happening is that there are plans to put data centers in space and other parts to make sure that all of what happens every single day of your life is absolutely cataloged and documented. And that means that those data points can be used to build better prediction engines. And then there's a thing called immersive dependence. You are dependent on all of this being around you. You cannot say that I don't support technology because the textiles machine that was used to make your shirt, make this computing, use your phone, the food that you buy, everything, you are part of the game. You just have to decide which game you play. And that game that you play, at some point, somebody will predict that you're going to play that game and they will want to manipulate you. And that means that the news that you read is not what I read. It's not what anybody else on the call reads. Everybody sees something that's highly customized just for them. And as soon as you show certain traits that you believe a certain kind of story, people can pay to be there. They can pay to be in your face. And that means this economic dependence and immersive behavior is altering the entire global system. And that means that, we just have to make sure that we are aware of all of this to be able to participate. Johan, shall I leave it at that?
Thank you, Jay. We can sit and listen all day to you. Yes, you can see all the hand applause there. Judy, just unmute yourself and pose your question that you typed in.
All right, it was fascinating talk, and my daughter is also highly immersed in all this AI and IoT, but my background is more psychology. Oh. So as much as we all love technology, every time I hear things like immersive dependence and totally programmable, I have to think, is technology destroying what it means to be human? Are we still human beings with free thought, etc., or are we totally programmed by everything that we do?
You know what, we had that question, we pose it in the social science when you do your first kind of entry point into the computational social science world, and it goes something like this. Imagine you could reframe yourself to 200,000 years ago. And one of your kids, you told them, through means of science and otherwise, not to go down the hill, because you live, or not to go up the mountain at least. You live in the valley where there are no real stones, and you've had this problem, breaking open this one nut, and you kind of ignored it because you never ate the nut by default. You only ate the berries. And then this one kid, there's always the one kid who never listens to you. I'm not sure. I've got a couple of kids, and there's a couple of them that never listen to you. Anyway, the kid runs up the mountain, goes and finds a rock, sharpens the rock as a tool, comes back, and opens the nut. And inside the nut is the most tastiest corn. And now you go, oh dear, what's going to happen to the human race? Are we going to be the same? We're not just going to eat berries anymore. Now we can also eat nuts. And you can have one or two responses. You can say, well, I'm not going to eat the nut. Just out of principle. It tastes amazing, but I'm not eating it because I'm not going to do what my kid was supposed to listen to me. I told them not to go up the mountain. They went up there. And then what happens is the next kid starts believing it, start eating it and go, wow, that's pretty good. And then your partner starts eating it. They, oh, wow, that's pretty good. And after a while, you're the only one not eating the nut spore. And then you have to decide, do I play the game or don't I?
Yep,
that means that we are who we are as humans. We have created the conditions. We have created this world. The only challenge is, I think, and Judith, this is probably the scariest part of it. And that's why I figured that today, I wasn't going to tell you about the future. I was only going to tell you about the past. Mm-hmm. Nothing I told you is new.
Yeah.
This is all how it already works. This is the current state of affairs. And I think sometimes we so worry about what's going to happen in the future, what's going to happen with population and environmental. And if you just had to look at the game you're playing right now, I bet you how many people here went and bought groceries that were packaged. So you cannot ask a question about environment unless you solve that first. So you play the game. You're immersed. You're programmed. You know what I mean? You can't now say, oh, no, I'm not going to play the game, but it's wrong. And I think that's why humans are so easy to influence. Because
that's the problem.
Yeah, because the things we say and the things we do have got nothing to do with each other.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, that's the future, but it's still a thought that plagues me.
Of course it does. And that's why, I mean, my kids, and you probably know the Waldorf school system, my kids go to Waldorf school system where I'm absolutely and utterly convinced. Even, you know, we moved from San Francisco to Cape Town, and I don't know if I've told anybody how I got here, but we were sitting there one day and I sold one of my companies to some Canadian business, and my wife and I and the kids were sitting there, were saying, well, we know that there's a new administration coming in and there's no ways we're going to be part of that. So we want to move somewhere. So do we move to Toronto? My family said, no, the weather is bad. Do we move to London? I was at the time building a bank in London. They said, well, no, they're not going to be able to live with the coldness. Are we going to go to Australia? I said, no, it's too far away. So why don't we just search for sunsets? World's best sunsets. And this beach, Long Beach, popped up as, and if you go search for it on Google, he said, world's best sunsets. This beach pops up. So we said, well, we've never lived in Cape Town. Let's go there. So that means that I use technology to give me insight into where to go. And then by the time I got here, my kids moved from the Waldorf School in Silicon Valley because, you know, Apple and Google and all those companies, top execs, send their kids to schools where there's no tech. Because we all know what it does. No gaming at all. They're not allowed to play games on machines at all until they get to their teens. So when we moved here, they go to the Waldorf School here across the mountain. And that means that it's only now that they got phones. You know, my oldest of my youngest is 16, right? And then my other one's 14. And now they got a device. There's no social media because you want to make sure that they're safe. They can use the device for one-on-one communication with friends, but no social media where they are vulnerable yet. And then they have to sign a contract to say that this is my contract of behavior. So yeah, no, Judith, I get it. We are acutely aware of people like ourselves who are on the other end of our spectrum, who, you know, that's why if you look at Noam Chomsky, I'm not sure if anybody know Noam Chomsky's work. For those who don't, really go look at it. You know, he's huge. He's a massive revolutionary in this space. He must be 90 years old now. And if you look at his history, it's still the most fascinating input into how you manipulate kids to get to their parents. And he was the one who basically called that out over the years. And yeah.
Jay, I really want to thank you for your time and effort. I know how busy you are. I think I understand you now better. The contradiction that my mind battled to come across, I understand it now much better, and I think I'll apply some of it in my own life. But thank you very much for that. Okay, today's tutorial links somehow with Jay's presentation. He actually put me onto this. It's about a useful app for both Android and Apple iOS phones. I didn't know about this app until Jay told me it about 2 months ago, so I looked it up and then I decided it's a perfect time to actually make you aware of it as well. It's available for free and it's already loaded onto most of your phones. You just might not know about it. Once you've used it, you will understand, well, I think you will have difficulty to understand how you got along without it. The link to the tutorial that I'll present to you about this app is, it's now on YouTube, on my YouTube channel, and I'll include it in the registration form that will follow. The registration form will just request your email address again and your rating of the meeting. It will take you again less than 3 minutes to complete. Thank you to those people who left positive comments in the previous forms and suggestions for future topics. I do try and plan with those comments that you send me. The link to that, I didn't know I can do that, will be at the bottom of the form. I will post the form just now. Our next meeting is on Wednesday, the 16th of December at 10 o'clock. Now, although this is a public holiday, the majority of you did vote that we will have a meeting on that day. So I've included only one topic on the 16th of December. Headlines from the Future is the name of a book that's written by Pieter Geldenhuys and Mia Slobbert. And Pieter will present an overview of the book, so you can expect the same level of enthusiasm and exciting information from Pieter that you've witnessed again today. You can click on the link now. It will open the form in your browser, and you can keep it open even after you've left the Zoom meeting. You can continue completing the form. Just remember to submit at the bottom, and then you can click on that link to the YouTube video about this app that I told you about. So that is the end of the meeting. Thank you for everyone, and I look forward to see you on the 16th of December.